The Y Curve with Phil Dobby and Roger Hearing.
Paris invaded by athletes and spectators.
A celebration of human potential in a capital of art and culture.
But is it also for many Parisians an unwelcome invasion that's closed cafes and bars behind security barriers?
And cost many millions that the city can ill afford.
Do gigantic sporting events like this bring benefits for the host, or just a long list of problems and debts?
Is it worth staging the Olympic Games?
The Y Curve.
So, I mean, it is the cost, isn't it? It is a hurdle of Olympic proportions, you might
say that. You might say that. And it does, and it keeps going, because, I mean, there are some of the former host cities who are still going, oh, my God, how are we going to deal with all this? And you say, well, OK, they've got lots of lovely sports stadiums that they built at huge cost that they can use for the future.
But are they commercially viable on an ongoing basis, even if you wrote the cost off?
Well, there's been a lot of trouble over all that stuff, the legacy, as they call it.
Yeah.
Even in London, there's been a big problems with the legacy.
Because the problem is that often they are in Olympic parks, which are away from where people live.
So there's not much good, really.
Yeah.
And they're built for elite athletes. They're not built for you and me or the likes.
What were you saying?
Yes, that's true.
I think that is the problem. I think we were just before we started talking, we were probably, it is quite an exclusive thing, the Olympics, because they do insist that you are quite fit.
It's amazing,
to take part in it.
I mean, what's that about?
Yeah. And I also think that, perhaps the answer is, if you want to get more money, is that it should be performed nude again, like it was originally.
Well, that would certainly,
just imagine the TV rights. They could charge a lot more for the TV rights.
Channel 5 would run it all night.
People would pay for subscription TV a lot more, wouldn't they, if it was all performed nude?
But there is a massive issue in that how are they going to keep these things being staged when, well, certainly with Commonwealth Games, which admittedly are different, so many cities don't want to stage them. It's actually becoming embarrassing.
Yeah. Well, Malaysia was supposed to be staging in 2026, weren't they? And I think they've pulled out now.
The Australians didn't want it, did they?
They would. The Gold Coast pull out their bid for 2026 as well. And then Victoria was supposed to be holding the 2022 games, and they pulled out, which I think is why it ended up in Birmingham, isn't it? So it's a last resort, the games of last resort. So, I mean, there's clearly the Commonwealth Games is a real problem.
And even the other things like the big international athletics things going on and the Winter Olympics, there's loads which do you...
Is there too much sport?
Yeah, what do you get out of it? That's the other thing, because in the end, that's what the cities will be interested in. And yes, you get lots of people turning up at the time, and broadcast rights, I suppose, but those are all tied up with the International Olympic Committee. It's not. That's where the money goes to, doesn't it? So the host city doesn't get any of the money at all from the broadcast rights? I don't know, indeed. We will find out, in fact, these very same details.
Well, lots of questions on it today, aren't there? And is it all just got too big? I mean, is there a way, actually? I think the Paris Olympics actually is a bit cheaper than, for example, the Tokyo Olympics. But imagine the Tokyo Olympics.
Tokyo Olympics didn't have any audience.
Yeah, exactly. Because it was during COVID. In fact, it was delayed by a year, wasn't it, of course? Yeah. So, I mean, they had the problem. They had the cost and none of the revenue from ticket sales, I guess. So
it's a mess in a lot of ways. And the Paris thing, and, why have to spend all this money on the opening ceremony, for heaven's sake?
Yeah.
I mean, what's that about?
That opening ceremony.
Yeah. Well, we'll draw a veil.
That was like a very bad French movie, wasn't it? Because French movies go on forever and ever. With that long scene where not a lot happens. There was a lot of that going on.
Cultural commentator Phil Dobby here. Who's a firm contributor to the Cahiers du Film, as you will well know.
Absolutely. Yeah, of course. Yeah, wherever that is.
All right, well, let's talk to someone who knows about staging these things and the cost thereof, and that's Simon Chadwick, professor at SKEMA Business School in France, teaching links between geopolitics, economics, and the world of sports, and he joins us now.
So, yes, actually, I think it's SKEMA, isn't it? Not SKEMA. You tell me, Simon. So is it SKEMA or SKEMA? And also, what does SKEMA...
It is SKEMA.
All right.
And
I stand corrected.
And what does it stand for?
It's the School of Knowledge, Economy and Management, and I can't remember what the A stands for.
That covers it, I'm sure.
Right.
Yes.
You really need to swat up on
we should do our research.
What the acronym is for where you work. But anyway, I mean, we've got an excuse, and I don't know about you. But anyway, we're looking at the Olympics and games generally and just how viable they are. I mean, it is becoming a problem, isn't it?
Your question is a really interesting one, because we in places like Britain, but also in the United States and Germany and France and other such places, we tend to look at mega events in a rational economic way. In other words, if you're gonna spend 10 billion or 20 billion or 30 billion, then surely you have to make 31 billion back or 32 billion back. In other words, there's got to be a return on investment, a tangible return on investment. But I think there are countries in the world that don't see it that way. And
like Qatar, for example.
Like Qatar, well, and again, that's really interesting because you've got Qatar. There is a rumor that Qatar will bid for the 2036 Olympic Games. There's a rumor too that Saudi Arabia will bid for the 2036 Olympic Games. And as we saw from the Qatar World Cup in 2022, this was almost a kind of money no object mega event. Although there were significant benefits for Qatar that we may not be able to measure economically. So I guess the first thing to say is it really depends who you ask and regarding what the kind of answer you would get about, do you need to make a return on investment from spending, billions of pounds on.
Well, let's pick up on that and say, well, okay, I mean, you talk about certain attitudes in the West. I suppose one thinks of the Los Angeles Olympics, the Tokyo Olympics, the Sydney Olympics, and of course the London Olympics. Did they, in terms of return on investment, and I suppose, again, even that's a complicated question, did they work?
Well, let's take a step even further back into history in the 1976 games in Montreal, because I think this was the games that shocked everyone because it took 30 years for local taxpayers, and I emphasize local taxpayers, to pay for the Montreal Games. And that kind of tax burden and the financial returns associated with that event was such that I think a lot of people felt, we just can't do this. And I guess if we fast forward to kind of about now, over the last 10 years, there have been referendums in Krakow, in Oslo, in Munich, where local government has asked local populations, do you think we should bid to host the Winter Olympic Games? And local populations have said, well, actually, no, we don't think you should do that. Because if you're going to spend billions of euros, billions of pounds on staging a mega event, wouldn't it be better to, for example, spend on hospitals and roads? So I think certainly in our part of the world, there is this angst about getting value for money and ensuring that if you do spending, or you spend €1, you've got to get €2 back. There's got to be a purpose for staging these kinds of events.
But I'm sure the attitude changes, doesn't it, depending on how well the economy is doing. So nobody is doing particularly well right now. So nobody wants to spend money that's not on hospitals or the police force or education. But when in good times, maybe people feel a bit more benevolent towards the idea.
Maybe back in the old days, but I'm not so sure now because, again, I think the interesting thing about, if we can call them broadly, Western democracies, is even in the case of France now, the French electorate weren't really asked, do you want to do this? It was a decision taken by François Hollande and taken up by Macron. And I think what's really happening inside France right now, we know politically what's happening inside France right now and has been for, certainly the last 2 or 3 months, is that this has become a kind of personal Macron pet project. And I think there are lots of French people who don't necessarily agree with what he's done and with what Paris is doing. And even with the contents of the opening ceremony, there are lots of people inside France didn't agree with what was happening. So I guess the point I'm making is often this is not a conscious choice on the part of people and populations. This is driven by politicians. And even if you look at our case, in London, in terms of London 2012, this was kind of more Blairite legacy than it was about having a vision, a purpose, a coherent strategy underpinning the games.
But it was a great party, wasn't it? And Sydney was the same as well. So I saw some numbers saying that Sydney costs in Australian dollars, so worthless basically, $6.5 billion. 2.5 billion came from the public sector. The rest came from the private sector. And in terms of the economic activity that was generated from it up to and after the game, so from 1994 to 2005, so basically over that 10 years, it paid back 5.1 billion, so 1.4 billion less than it cost. But over 10 years, I mean, most people would say, yeah, but we've got great memories from it. So actually the payback in terms of how we feel about being Australian, most people would probably say, yes, it was a good investment.
Now, that is an illustration, I think, of, in general, what typically tends to happen around not just Summer Olympic Games, but Winter Olympic Games as well, which is there is a marginal loss associated with staging these events. it is unusual, certainly according to the research, it is unusual to come out ahead. So in the case of London, you spend £10 billion. If you're lucky, you might come out evens. You generate benefits of 10 billion as well. But in many cases, we haven't seen that. I mean, it's really interesting what's happening in Paris right now because, for example, hotel bookings across the city are down by up to 50% in some cases, because basically people are staying away. They don't want to go somewhere where there are going to be crowds, there are going to be lots of police, and potentially there could be trouble. So they've gone elsewhere. And so
the security barriers mean a lot of the pubs and the bars and cafes are closed anyway.
Well, absolutely. And you go to Paris for a particular experience, and if you go to Paris right now, you're not going to get that experience. So there is an economic impact. But I think what's interesting about, again, if we could call it this, the Western world, is we are thinking about these type of calculations. And maybe to feel good about ourselves, making a loss of €1 billion or £1 billion is acceptable. I think where we have all been scared, or where the frighteners have come from, if we can put it that way, is from, for example, Russia in 2014, the Sochi Winter Games, which cost $60 billion to stage. And there was a feeling, or there has been a feeling over the last decade amongst people working in the industry that essentially, if we get into this kind of arms race of spending on the Olympic Games, then it will disaffect people and cities will go cold on the idea. I think what France has done, and France is about €7 billion, I believe. France has kind of reassured us that there are cost-effective ways of doing this, and we don't have to get drawn into these extravaganzas that cost huge amounts of money.
And it still has the same effect, doesn't it? Because, I mean, okay, the opening ceremony was a bit tedious, wasn't it? But it wasn't helped by the fact it was raining. But then the next day, I was watching in the grounds of Versailles, the horse. The equestrian events, and it just looked beautiful, and it really, so I was thinking, I really want to go back to Versailles. It sells the country well, doesn't it? And it also sells the culture. But
what about the selling? I mean, on the spreadsheet side with this, Simon, I mean, we're talking in big terms about how where the money comes back. What's on the debit and what's on the credit side? So I mean, if you on the debit side, I mean, obviously there's the cost of building the places where people stay and the places where people compete, and I suppose the whole security thing and putting on facilities for spectators. And on the other side, I mean, where does the money come from? I suppose I mean, the ticket prices, does that go to the Olympic Committee? Does it go to the host city? What about the broadcast rights? I mean, what are the balances on that?
Because most of the broadcast rights goes to the IOC, doesn't it? And that is the largest source of revenue.
There's like 6 million different things in there that you're now asking me to unpick.
Pick out the ones that you fancy.
We're going to sit down and have a coffee now. Just tell us how it all works.
My holiday starts now, so I'll come back later and answer that question. I mean, on your point about Versailles, this is the point. And you gave some figures earlier about Sydney over a 10-year period, and that is the point. Because one of the economic impacts of staging a mega event in a particular country is that you will have, for instance, return visits. So all those people who are in Paris now who've gone to see the Olympic Games will think, wow, this is actually quite nice. We'll come back.
It's a short window, isn't it?
Yeah, be nice to go back when the bars are open.
When it's over. And so this is a tangible economic impact. So Macron and France more generally, part of the plan is to showcase the Eiffel Tower and to showcase the Louvre and Versailles, because Paris has got a place in the world that it not only needs to maintain, but really to kind of assert. So that's one part of this. I mean, in terms of the other things that you mentioned, one of the things that I think that is really, really important about what's now happening in Paris is if we take the Athletes' Village, for example. So the whole point about the Athletes' Village in France is that it does have a life after the Games is over. And we see the same in London. You go out to Stratford, and, back in the day, Stratford wasn't the kind of place that lots of people would necessarily go to. But now this is a living, breathing community. The Qataris bought the Athlete Village, and this is a place where people now live and work and go out dining and socialise and so forth. And the same thing is happening in Paris now. Now, what's interesting about the Athletes' Village is the role that Accor plays, and your listeners may be familiar with Accor because of Pullman Hotels or Sofitel or Ibis, and so they're running the Athletes' Village, and when the Games is over, this Athletes' Village will presumably become some form of residential accommodation. Although there is a question, I think it's an important question about what kind of residential accommodation. So I guess that leads me on to the third point, which is about your debit and credit, is the Olympic Games as a circus. It comes to town for 2 weeks, and the economic consequences of what happens next is really left with the host city. So what the Olympic Games is doing is obviously it's generating revenues from TV and from sponsorships for the IOC itself. But locally, what you are looking at is obviously you've got to make the most of sponsorship arrangements. And you'll find if you go to the IOC website that there are lots of local sponsors, Carrefour supermarkets, for example. So that's one way of generating revenues. And of course, there are these accompanying programs, cultural programs, entertainment programs that drive tourism numbers, and that has an economic impact as well. And this, one of the things that the French are very big on right now is public-private sector partnership. And so several of those venues have been developed or are being utilized as public-private sector partnerships. And so revenues are being derived from the private sector as well.
Should the IOC be putting some more of their money, though, into the games? Because, I mean, they are getting a slug of the money, aren't they? They're getting of the revenue because they're getting all the broadcast rights, as I understand it. And then looking on the IOC website, what do they do with that? Well, they say they use it to fund athlete development, $4.2 million every day. They say they spend on that. And of course, we've had a whole load of accusations about members taking bribes in the IOC. If you're dealing with that kind of money, you can imagine that there would be a bit of corruption around naturally anyway. I mean, has the IOC just become too big? And if it is taking this money, should some of those broadcast rights actually be going to the host city rather than to the IOC?
Would that make it more viable if they did?
Yeah.
I mean, the important thing to keep in mind, I guess there are two things. Firstly, is do we as a world want an Olympic Games? And, if we do, then organizing these types of events are really complex. If you're talking about large numbers of athletes and members of the media and spectators congregating in one place to watch these multi-sport events, these are complex and it costs money to stage them. Whether the IOC and its current model is the best way of delivering an event of this nature, I think is a question that needs to be debated and discussed. But in fairness to the IOC, essentially the IOC is I guess how can we describe this? It's got a two-shot strategy. So it's going to make money at the Winter Olympic Games. It's going to make less money at the Summer Olympic Games. So this is not Amazon. It's not selling things all day, every day. Essentially their business model is oriented around these mega events that take place infrequently. So it has to make the most of them. But you do raise a really important question. I mean, I guess for most of us, we might ask ourselves, well, what does the IOC actually do? And I guess once, this time next year when the Olympics is gone, most of us, if we were to ask, well, what does the IOC do? We wouldn't be able to talk about athlete development or helping impoverished communities around the world. And so I think the IOC does need to represent itself more effectively so that we do understand what it actually does.
Well, can you give examples for that 4.2 million a day? Can you give us?
You want to know the truth?
Yeah.
No, I can't.
Because they're not out there.
Because it needs to be more visible. Yeah. So they're not helping themselves.
And I think you raise a really, really important point. You use the word, the B word, and this is a word that I know that people inside governing bodies always break out.
Bribery. Yeah, Phil is looking confused.
Yeah. The governing
Not
bodies in sport always worry about this word, but I think these organisations are so large. And there is this kind of gravy train effect. If you can get a job for the IOC and travel the world and stay in nice hotels and so on and so forth, what a great, unlike you and me, we've got to do things like this to make a living. Yeah. There is a gravy train, and as we've seen in the past with the IOC, and we've also seen in the past with, for example, FIFA, there is sometimes activity that many of us would deem to be unacceptable. And I think when you're dealing with a global organization, such large amounts of money, it isn't particularly transparent. Sometimes issues around poor governance, bribery, and other such activities do arise. And I think for me personally, in our globalized world, we have these large organizations, and I've mentioned Amazon as one, I mentioned Accor Hotels as another. How you actually govern these organizations and how you remain transparent, relevant to people's lives, how you explain yourself, how you account for the money that you've spent. There's a lot of improvement to be made, I think.
Yeah, because otherwise we do have this image in our mind, don't we, that somebody is sitting in a bar somewhere, smoking a cigar, drinking fine whiskey, and saying, well, I'm doing my bit for helping athlete development.
But I suppose the point in all this really is maybe the commercial one. There's a history of the Olympics being seen as the amateur sport. It's where everyone's clean and above all this. And as you said, there's an awful lot of sponsorship in the background of all this. I love there was a picture floating around a couple of weeks ago from the Los Angeles Olympics in the 80s, which had a picture of the official cigarette of the Olympics and how that was being pushed. Things have changed a lot, but sponsorship is there. Maybe if, rather than cities hosting, you almost went more commercial, almost had, companies hosting these things. We get around all these problems because they have the money to do it. They get the benefit from doing it.
Well, and then the company chooses which city it's going to be held in.
Pretty much, and pays for it. I mean, maybe we're too hung up.
But it's too much for one company, I think.
I'm sure Microsoft could do it without turning a hair. Yeah. But, maybe that's where it needs to be, Simon, in order to make it more viable.
That's a really interesting point that you make, because there is a World Corporate Games, for example. So, we do already have global sport mega events run by companies. They call the World Corporate Games. But this really drives to the heart of what do we want the Olympics to be?
It's not the flavour we want, is it?
Do we actually need events like this? Do we as a world, do we derive significant benefit from having the Olympic Games? Do we believe that it should continue in its current form? And if we do, then great. Now, let's talk about it. Let's have an open discussion. Let's have a dialogue about what that might look like. Or do we need new and different models? And I think we are. For me personally, I do think that the IOC faces some existential threats right now. And you talk about, corporate games. We've already seen Red Bull with the X Games posing quite a significant threat to the IOC. But at the same time, another one for you is in September in Russia, there is the World Friendship Games, which is a Putin invention, which looks like the Olympic Games and sounds like.
Yeah, the Ukrainian team will be fascinating,
exactly.
Wouldn't it?
They're going to be a big turnout for that one,
so there are 70 nations have committed to the World Friendship Games, and so the IOC and the Olympic Games do face existential threats, and so they do need to remain kind of nimble and lean and adaptable and really respond to changes in the world. And I'm not sure the IOC is really in that position to be able to do that effectively. And so as we move forward, let's say as we move forward up to 2050, I do think that we will see the IOC being forced to contemplate different operating models. And it could be that we've got, kind of what they call polycentric staging. And polycentric staging is, let's take the 2036. How would it be if Doha and Riyadh together staged the 2036 Olympic Games?
Well, they had the Japan and Korea one at the same. Was that?
That was a World Cup. That was the World Cup.
But I mean, a similar model, an idea.
Well, absolutely, and we are seeing, and if we go to the next Football World Cup in 2026, you've got the United States, Mexico, and Canada sharing hosting. Same again in 2030.
Yeah, make a lot of sense, wouldn't it?
So there are different ways of doing things.
Unless we get Russia to actually host an Olympics, because it's so expensive, that would
bankrupt
mean less money for the war effort. Perhaps.
Well, I guess what we could do, we could force Russia to pay for everything and pretend that we like them, and then we can pretend that we like them.
Just until the games are over.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yes.
Got you. But are there too many sports as well? So we've got this time, new sports, skateboarding, surfing.
Breakdancing?
Is there breakdancing, sport climbing, 32 different sports, and then, different categories within those. So equestrian is just one, gymnastics is just one. So, actually hundreds of different events. Whereas the original games was running, boxing of the new games, running, boxing, wrestling, pancration, which is basically fighting without any rules whatsoever. I quite like the sound of that one.
That sounds like my hometown.
That would appeal to the Russians, I suspect.
It sounds like your hometown, did you say? Yeah. Equestrian and pentathlon. That was it. I mean, has it just got too big, and does it need to be scaled back?
I mean, again, super quick. I'm saying this to all of your questions. Super question.
We're asking a lot of good questions this week.
I know in previous weeks you've not been performing well, but you've upped your game this week. So
we're rising to the Olympic level.
Well, absolutely. Great question. So right now, one of the things that a lot of people aren't noticing, but right now in Saudi Arabia, the Esport World Cup is taking place. And of course, at some stage in the near future, we're going to see esports and digital sports of various types also entering the Olympic Games. So it seems as though that there is this proliferation of sports in the Olympic Games. And keep in mind, this is set against the context of a world of sport where we are seeing this, not just the proliferation of different sports, but also the proliferation of different formats. And if you think about cricket, for example, in the range of different formats, rugby in the range of different formats, and we are heading towards a point where I think for many people there will be format fatigue. And again, I speak personally. In my case, I kind of switched off to cricket quite a long time ago because I could never figure out who was playing when and what formats were developing and which were less popular, and so people will eventually start to switch off. So again, it is incumbent upon the IOC to get the optimum number of events right.
But it has to be inclusive, doesn't it? That's the point. You have BMX bikes or breakdancing. That includes a lot of people who wouldn't otherwise be interested or participate in the Olympics.
Well, as two old guys, actually as three old guys, as we will know that we live in a Gen Z world. And Gen Z consumers are saying, well, we want console gaming in the Olympic Games, and we want BMX, skateboard, breakdancing. We don't want to see dressage, for example. And so I think the natural evolution of human populations are going to place significant pressure on the IOC to adapt and change. But
I mean, adding gaming is quite cheap, isn't it, really? Because first of all, you run it overnight because that's when they're all up, and you just hold it in a small dark room.
Well, you wouldn't even need to be there. You could do it from home. You wouldn't actually
go anywhere. You wouldn't need to.
Well, there's your hosting solution straight away. There, you just play at home.
Audience gone as well.
It's really interesting that obviously the IOC is now looking at this. They've already said no shooting games. So they're not going to have games in the Olympics where anybody gets killed. But then there are obviously different types of, if you think about, there are console games that involve kind of participative, collaborative decision making, and then there are other games that involve competing with one another. So there's a whole bunch of, what will these games be and who?
But it's just adding more, isn't it? To it's broadening the brief. Whereas does it actually need to be brought down? But look, maybe the Olympics can survive if it's sort of scaled back a bit and countries don't go too crazy. I mean, you can showcase your country without spending a fortune, and hopefully Paris is a bit of an example of stepping in the right direction on that. But beyond the Olympics, what about the Commonwealth Games? Because
that's been a real problem.
No one wants that. So Victoria pulled out. Victoria in Australia pulled out the 2022 Games. I think that's why it went to Birmingham, isn't it? Because they pulled out. And then the Gold Coast has pulled out their bidding for 2026, also from Australia. Malaysia has rejected the offer to host the 2026 Commonwealth Games. So I'm not quite sure if we actually know who's hosting it in a couple of years' time. So there's a huge lack of interest in the Commonwealth Games. I mean, has it had its day?
And unless the Commonwealth Games can establish itself with a new proposition, then personally I think its days are numbered.
Is that because the concept of the Commonwealth isn't a thing, or just the fact there are too many games like this?
Well, so again, going back to your previous question, do we really need another sport mega event? In addition to the Olympic Games, we've also got the Commonwealth Games, and we've got Putin's friendship games. So this is where does this end? We're going to be all consumed by mega events with different sport. This has got to end at some stage. So there is that kind of format fatigue that I talked about earlier. But I think implicitly, the whole notion of a British Commonwealth and what that means is somewhat outdated now, and we live in a world where there is this pivot from global north to global south, where the economic and political powerhouses are not in places like London. They are in places like Malaysia and Singapore, Thailand, India, and so forth, and they don't want to be reminded of their colonial past, and indeed they feel that they now have the power, the self-confidence, the identity not to have to participate or at least host this kind of event. So for me, I think the Commonwealth Games is on a long goodbye unless somebody comes up with a really great idea for it.
I never agree. I mean, I do watch the Olympics on TV and do get quite excited about it. Look at Commonwealth Games, I don't fail to get motivated by it. Maybe we could run it at the same time, actually. We should just give out Commonwealth medals during the Olympics. So if the UK came fourth, for example, and the top three weren't Commonwealth countries, then we get the gold Commonwealth Games medal. Just, sort of like, because that's all it is, isn't it, really? It's like, well, you can do well in the Commonwealth Games because all the best competitors aren't in the Commonwealth.
I don't think that's going to work. But I mean, I suppose somebody.
Simon is silent on that. I don't think it's pure gold as a suggestion. We're obviously not firing on that one.
Anyway, you should sell that to someone because there's somebody. Maybe you should sell it to a Gulf state with billions of dollars.
So like a Commonwealth Games on paper. That's all.
Well, but then I mean, drawing this all together, Simon, what you're saying is that the Olympics need to change their style. Perhaps overall, we need a cutback both in the number of events that are in any given Olympics. And perhaps also overall, we don't need as many big sporting events. It just isn't necessary because all it's doing really is waving a flag, and a very expensive flag.
Two issues, I think, for me is we all live in an attention economy where we've got competing demands for our time, competing demands on our mobile phones, and alongside that, we are time impoverished, which means that we all have the attention spans of a flea. And so I think there is a really important issue there for the Olympics to get to grips with, is in our kind of complex and fast changing world, how can they stay relevant? But I think the second issue alongside that is, who's going to drive this change? Because this is not like, for example, in Britain, like we've got the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. Clearly there is a minister and there's a prime minister, there's a cabinet, there's a parliament that oversees that. And if the DCMS isn't doing its job properly, then we call it to account. But in the IOC's case, who's going to call it to account? So how the IOC and how the Olympics are governed raises some really important questions. Now, it could be that we let the marketplace govern, and you've already talked about having corporations dictate to the IOC about what should and shouldn't happen. But even so, the IOC, I think, still retains a considerable amount of power in that equation. So there is no what I'm trying to say is there is no supra global body that sits there overlooking the IOC, calling it to account. So if we believe that the IOC is too bloated, there are too many sports, there are possibly some suspicious individuals working inside the organization, we believe that bad decisions are made to take the event to certain countries that we don't like. Ultimately, who calls this to account?
Yeah, because that is a good question.
Maybe the UN? I don't know.
Yeah.
UNESCO? It doesn't seem very likely. In the end, they have a power and they want to keep the power, I'm sure.
As Homer Simpson said in The Simpsons, maybe the Coast Guard. That's I don't know if you've ever seen that episode. Who polices the police? And Homer Simpson's answer to that is the Coast Guard.
Well, there we are. That's widened it to the
Not
Coast Guard taking over the IOC. Anyway,
so it sounds like we've had some good solutions though. So I mean, maybe the IOC are listening today, because they're desperate. And our message to them is, well, first of all, you've got to promote what you do a little bit more. You've got to explain what you're doing with all this.
You've got to be a little bit less corrupt.
A little bit less corrupt, and then the idea that the games maybe are the fewer actual sports taking part, or they just get chunked up, and so you have multiple venues, multiple countries bidding for each one. And you could chunk it up, couldn't you? Say, well, okay, all of the track and field is going to be in one country, all the equestrian and other stuff is going to be in another country, and maybe some places are. And here's the thing, you build facilities, and maybe they just get reused.
Yeah,
so, for example, equestrian, for example, you might go, well, actually, there's a few countries in the world which are quite strong on that and have got the facilities.
They could do it.
So they could do it share it amongst themselves every few times.
Well, of course, the Greeks used to have the same place staged every year.
Well, there we are. So there's the other thing.
Which is another
is it just held in Greece every year?
Yeah, let's go to Olympia.
The World Cup's held in England. The Olympics. The Olympic. Well, we could let Scotland have it sometimes.
Maybe the Greeks could sing "It's Coming Home." They could have their own version of it.
It's already home. Yeah.
But I mean, if I could just do one final thing on that is that France perhaps is providing some solutions, not just with Paris now. And as we can see, there are temporary venues using existing facilities. But in 2030, they're also going to host the Winter Olympic Games. And exactly the same model is going to be employed in 2030. So Nice will be the focus, but all of the events, things like ice hockey and curling and this kind of thing will take place in downtown Nice in an existing venue that already exists. All of the skiing events will take place up in the Alps. So again, different places, not in the same place, in different places, but they will use existing infrastructure. So the transport systems are already there. The rail networks are already there. The road networks are already there. The resorts are already there. So, France may, without us realizing it right now, France may be providing us with some pointers for the long-term sustainability of the games.
Right. And that could be a decision that the IOC makes, just how sustainable is the solution that you're providing. And also, is it good for the planet? So building a whole load of concrete constructions, which might be Saudi Arabia's answer to everything, to try and cater for a short-term need, is not good for the environment. So you're dismissed on that basis, for example. They perhaps need to pander a bit more to the planet, which is quite important to all of us.
We've got 2024, just mentioned 2030 in the Winter Olympics. We've got 2028 in Los Angeles. And again, I'm sure that as we saw in 1984 in Los Angeles, 2028 will be a financially sustainable games. And so, we can kind of pat ourselves on the back and say, you know what, we've turned a corner and the IOC is operating in a not just in a more financially sustainable way, but a more environmentally sustainable way. And then Riyadh makes a bid for 2036, a huge amount of money derived from fossil fuel revenues. Is it going to take place in the middle of the summer? Are you going to have air-conditioned venues? Is it going to be a different time of the?
I know, crazy, isn't it? Well, Saudi Arabia is the only bidder, I think, for the 2034 World Cup.
So this was confirmed within the last week. This has been confirmed. But all of that does raise issues around where has the money come from? How is the money being spent? On what basis is the event being staged? And so we can sit here now and pat ourselves on the back and say, everything's going to be okay. The French have shown us the way. But I think when the big money comes along, and this kind of money, no object spending that I mentioned right at the very start of the podcast, we'll see how the IOC responds to that.
And that is a travesty. And the fact that they are the only bidder means, as no one else is interested. And this is the World Cup, which you would assume would be a little bit cheaper to stage.
And how many South Asian workers will die building whatever it is they do, which is, of course, another issue again. But there we are.
There's a cheery note to finish on. Good to talk. We always like to finish on a high, Simon. Good to have you on.
Thanks very much for inviting me.
So next week, something else that maybe not financially viable.
Very expensive, and we're talking about education.
Yeah, university education.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we've also got the whole thing with private schools right now as well. With those private schools saying, we can't survive if we have to charge VAT.
Well, of course, they have been in a way over dominant in the universities for a very long time. That's easing back, but there's a massive crisis in universities. A sense that a large number are simply going to go bankrupt, and the new government has to decide what the hell it's going to do, because the whole basis of
which sorts of universities, though?
Well, any kind of university. I mean, a lot of even the big and older ones, the polytechnics that became universities, a lot of them are in deep trouble.
Yeah.
But even some of the older universities are also suffering, and a lot of it's to do with the access to foreign students, which is not what it was.
Yeah.
But just the financial model, the viability of the model.
Well, is it a bit like the Olympics? Are there just too many subjects?
Could be.
And
Too many places.
Too many places, too many subjects, too many people going to university.
Well, that is an interesting and open subject, which is part of the problem. But there's going to be a sense there have to be amalgamations, all kinds of things. And the government has got to take this on because the education sector is apparently, now a lot of people are, I suppose, going to get their A-level results within the next week or so and will be making their choices about where they go. And there's not even a guarantee, apparently, that some of the courses they've applied for are actually going to happen.
Yeah.
Or even the university still being there. So let's see.
So, I mean, of course, it was a very different story, wasn't it, when the government paid for everything, but so few people went to university comparatively in those days. And so universities are having to maybe create a lot of these courses to try and get the money in to try and keep them afloat. So where is the balance? We can investigate all of that
We will talk all about that next week here on
The Why Curve. See you next week. Have a great week.
The Why Curve.